Have you thought of breaking through? Ain't it part of what you do? Catch a victim while he's dumb, break his larynx with your it's high time, and it's time to get high. Well, this ain't no goddamn dream, it's exactly what it seems. Wake up today just to lay back down and say, I won't be coming back. Let's call it a heart attack. Give me some of that knack. This is just a final payback. They all flipped on me, took my passions, left me be. When I had a place to sit, a goddamn attitude to fit. Talk real smooth, knew where to spit. But things have changed and I've quit. Got nothing to look forward to but a backlash full of lies. You're too late where you're going. This is fate, the whistle's blowing. It's much too late. It's all too late. You're much too late. Like a piss hole punk with his nose turned up and a fragrance all your own. Tell me what it's like to be alone. And let's not forget the Scarface prick who offers fix to your face. He dropped out of the subhuman race. Sad. Boo-hoo-hoo. But I'm goddamn glad that piece of shit was just a fad. Tell me, boy, where were you? What's your story?
And welcome back to another special edition of the Michael Decon program. So glad to see all of you out there, and in a moment, we will be joined by Mr. Mark Stavish, the Director of Studies for the Institute for Hermetic Studies and a lifelong student of esotericism. And of course, I am joined by my co-host, Mr. Mike Hideous. Mike, are you out there?
Mr. Decon, welcome to another fabulous night. Looking forward to the show tonight.
Oh yes, and my apologies for Captain, the Lost Long Parrot.
Oh, thank you, buddy. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear about that.
Yeah, it was his birthday today. He would have been 18.
Ooh, good year.
Yep.
Poor little guy.
Yeah. Yep. Miss him much.
Oh yes, and of course we are joined by Mr. Mark Stavish right now. Mark, how's it going?
It's good. How are things with you guys?
We are good. We are surviving. We are living coronavirus free. Mark, I hope you are under the same mindset and presence right now.
Well, we're good to go from the beginning, and I would just say I was not caught up in any rush for toilet paper.
Nice.
I had 100 rolls here myself to begin with, so we were good to go from the beginning. And
right.
I just have to make sure for the next disaster I have more chocolate on hand, and everything will be fine.
Very good, very good. And Mark, welcome back to the program. We had spoke a long time ago, so thank you so much for being here and spending some time with us. And of course, lots to go over. And Mark, how is the family doing, by the way? I forgot to ask.
Well, they're all quite busy because of, as some of you know, my wife is a teacher, and
right.
She had to take a crash course in trying to teach from home using, different online platforms, which she was unfamiliar with. And she teaches biology and chemistry. So those are very difficult subjects to teach in person, let alone, in some distance learning framework. And my sons, of course, are trying to do the same with their classes. So other than that, they're doing fine.
That's good. Very good to hear. And I know about the wife with her background and your background. Is there any conflict there of beliefs? That's all. That's something I'm always curious about.
Not really. I mean, except I mean, generally, I tend to take a different view than she does on some things. I mean, when we look at the, of course, current events, I simply say, well, that's nice, dear, but the Chinese lie about everything. So we'll wait and see if those numbers are true, and that's usually about the only area of disagreement. You know, she's very thorough in everything she does, and has an understanding of course, the physical sciences quite well with a PhD from Brown, and also very skilled and knowledgeable in Vajrayana. So she's well-rounded.
Very nice, very nice. And of course, you've been studying about all these things, esotericism, for over 35 years, it says in your bio. And my God, that's a long time, Mark.
That bio's dated.
Yeah, I know. There's much more now.
Yeah, it's probably more like, let's see, 45. So, you know, it's been a while.
It really has. And Mark, what exactly was the catalyst for you to go down this sort of path here?
Well, as some of the listeners know, and from some of the publications I've done, some of my family members were involved in German folk magic, and my great uncle was connected to all of the various esoteric movements of the early 20th century. I mean, he was born in 1900. He died in 1996, so he saw the span of things, and
Wow.
he was deeply involved in quite a few of these groups, particularly AMORC and its Martinist offshoot, and SRIA under Plummer, and I even found a certificate from the 20s from the Brotherhood of Light, C.Z. Zane's signature on it, then when he was involved. So a lot of connections there, and of course connections going back to European occultism.
And Mark, were you at all raised with any sort of religion around you?
Well, yes, we were marginally Lutheran.
Okay. And Mark, do you believe in God?
Yeah. I tend to skip that question because everyone has a different definition of what that is. So it's hard to say. I mean, I have my own notion of what God is, and hopefully it's close or a reasonable proximity. But I mean, the whole notion of spirituality, it does involve the idea that there are intelligence and energy and forces that affect and shape the physical world. And that in turn there's a feedback loop, and the physical world can have an impact to some degree on the psychic, on the spiritual, but that for the most part the physical world is an effect, it is not a cause.
Understood.
Yeah.
And of course, what would you make of this new paradigm shift that we are all experiencing? It seems like lots of the New Agers out there have been talking about this. It's always been surrounded by the whole doom and gloom aspect.
Well, I think there's several paradigm shifts happening, and it's really hard to say. You know, when we look at current events, many people will always attempt to interpret it along their redesigned paradigm. So you see some fundamentalist groups looking at it in terms of their vision of the end days. You see the same with some very conservative Jewish groups. You see some of that occasionally with some of the Hindu groups. The Tibetans have always advocated that we're in the Kali Yuga. So where we're going and how to say what is this shift, I think if we look at it cyclically, there are always shifts happening. It's just a matter of how big are they. And what we're experiencing now is, you know, as I said to someone, a friend of mine called me, and he said, you know, his sister wanted to get a gun. And he said, now, 2 or 3 months ago, she was, you know, a rabid anti-gun, you know, owner, you know, didn't see any reason to own them. Of course, he lives in Montana. He has a concealed carry permit. And he talked to her and he said, well, I really don't think you should get one. And she said, why? I said, because I don't think you have the mental framework that's required to own, train, and use one.
Really?
But she insisted. So they went to a store, and he's, helped her decide on one. Then when they go to pay, she's terribly upset that she has to go through the waiting period.
Right.
Now, 2 months ago, she wanted everyone to not even own them. Now she's upset that she can't walk out the store with her gun. And I said to him, well, you know what that is? He goes, well, you know what the old joke is? He goes, what? You know what the difference between what a conservative is? And he goes, what? It's a liberal who's been mugged.
Love that.
And I said, and what we were experiencing right now is kind of a collective mugging. That's why you see that kind of dramatic shift in her. 2 months ago, that's gone. She doesn't even remember that.
That's so funny.
And you see a lot of people.
I don't mean to interrupt,
areas.
but I got to tell you, I was a politically correct liberal Democrat for 26 years. And I got mugged, and that's what changed me from being a liberal.
That's all it takes, Mike.
Yep. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Mark, but I had to say that.
Well, I could tell from the way you laughed, and not to make this political, but to demonstrate that, because the politics is philosophy in action, and that our philosophical views shift according to the experiences we have. And traumatic experiences create traumatic shifts in philosophical views. And when we're collectively mugged or individually mugged, we make choices. And because it's a threat to our security, but not only that, but our survivability, our actual existence. It's an existential threat. And that forces us to address the 4 existential crises that we often ignore in life. And the big one, of course, has to do with mortality. And then, of course, having to do with meaning in life and what does it, mean to be alone and the meaning of existence and all that stuff. So, but the reality is what we're seeing take place right now across the industrialized world and large swaths of the rest of the world, in Asia and Africa, but primarily Europe and North America I'm talking about, is that existential crisis, that realization that things change, they can change rapidly and quickly. Security that we thought we had, we don't have, and that we actually, push comes to shove, have very little control over a lot of things. And so, how does that translate into the new paradigm? It's going to be paradigms.
Right.
It's not going to be a single paradigm. It never was, because a single paradigm is monotheism, and monotheism is the closest thing you get to materialism and still claim to be spiritual. Because it's a singularity, which means it has ultimately inflexibility.
And Mark, I hate to backtrack quickly here, but what exactly are your thoughts on COVID-19 and what's currently happening right now? We are all sequestered, people are afraid, and it doesn't seem to end for nobody right now. It seems like our civil liberties will be eroded as time goes on, and that's the sad part. You have Bill Gates out there proposing a digital vaccine certificate for all Americans out there. I mean, soon enough, you won't be able to go to an airport per se without having some sort of special ID tag, either physically around your neck or even embedded into the skin of, like, say, your wrist, perhaps.
Well, 2 things here. First, the funny part.
Go ahead. I love that.
And several years ago, I started annoying a lot of my esoteric and occultist friends because, of course, most of them tend to. And I don't know when this happened. I made a joke about this a few days ago online. I said, when did occultists become muggles? And
yes,
the joke being that, and I don't know if you read it or not, but if you look at all these great predictions of how the world would go, and you start, say, around the 80s or 90s, and you tabulate them, the fundamentalist Christians have done a far better job at prophesizing than most of the occultists I know. if you go down the laundry list of how we got to this point, and you look around at what's happening. So with that as kind of the humorous setup, I think when we look at a situation like COVID-19, we have to look at it from, again, a polytheistic point of view. And I use that word specifically because we just talked about, singularity being a form of materialism, and monotheism being very close to materialism in many ways, and still the closest you can get to being a materialist and still claim a spiritual direction. Because singularity it's just that. It's going to be just this. And you see people want to fall into an acceptance of certain ideas where this is the answer. Okay. And it's a very complex notion.
Right.
So if you look at COVID-19, I said to someone, well, it's probably a biological weapon. And they said, but it shows, according to the data, it shows no signs of being modified. I said, well, two things there. First, it shows no signs according to whose data? The data which you have available to you. I said, that's the first thing. The second thing is, it doesn't have to be modified to be a weapon. Okay? Smallpox is a weapon. All they needed were blankets. They didn't need to genetically alter it in any way. The other thing is, and so maybe a third point, as I said, the lab that was in, or may have come from, we'll emphasize that, and it appears that it probably did. We have enough intelligence agencies and people in China suggesting it came from the lab and people who work there. That lab is part of the Chinese military. That means everything in that is a weapon, even the pencils.
Right.
They're not there for, writing peace treaties. And so this is kind of the framework you have to kind of recognize. There's multiple levels to it. Now, even if it is something that isn't come from the lab, it just did come from nature, okay, in that respect. Maybe someone did get it from eating a bat, as we're told. The fact is the Chinese lied about it for months.
They sure did.
And in that aspect, they committed a crime against humanity, because now this spread. But from their perspective as a military state, China is first and foremost a military state. Okay? And everything they do is weaponized. So even the production, the factories. I know people who've done business in China, and they would constantly complain about just the lying and the stealing, and the copyright infringement and all this stuff.
That's right.
But I say, so everything is weaponized against everyone else. And where you have this problem in Western spirituality is just that, is Western spirituality, okay? And it basically, you have a lot of people, whether they're New Agers, neo-pagans, Buddhist converts or converts to Buddhism, is they tend to believe that the rest of the world has these quaint Enlightenment virtues or values, or middle-class Protestant notions, okay, 20th century Protestant middle-class notions, and that if they don't, somehow they can just somehow become adapted to it and see the light. Well, these aren't universal values. And we have to understand, many people, particularly in the spiritual community, don't really want to grasp that notion, that not everyone shares the same values they do. They don't even share the same values across the different groups, but more importantly, these very strongly held notions of what, of human interaction and in relationships and human life and value, they're not universally held. And for a variety of reasons, that of course are cultural and economic and historical. And that makes the discussion really very difficult. So, they let this spread to the rest of the world, and why not? Why should they be the only one who's damaged by it?
Yeah, the CCP, this communist virus, this plague has been spread out everywhere. And again, news articles have been saying as far back as late November, the U.S. intelligence officials were warned about this. And it's quite ironic that they were warned about this and no action was taken immediately. It reminds me of 9/11 as well. They were warned and they didn't do shit either.
Well, two stories there. One is several years ago, I was with my wife. We were at a gathering, and one of the women there was a Romanian doctor. She worked for the World Health Organization in epidemiology. Our discussion was interspiced with her talking to my wife about biology, a brief interruption when she was speaking to the Polish ambassador to the United States, and then some of our discussions around publishing. So she wrote a book. She wrote 3 books, in fact, novels, and one of them was something, I think the title was like "How to Start an Epidemic." And it was published around 2001 or 2 or
Wow.
something like that. And the FBI visited her, and she said
Wow.
it was really kind of funny.
My goodness.
Because they thought that somehow this was a how-to manual. And she said, well, this is a very thorough book about, a novel about an epidemic, but if anyone has the ability to do what's in here, they don't need a manual on how to spread it around. They already know. Okay. And I think that's one of the problems with various intelligence services. They take things very seriously. They have to, but that also means very literally. And I heard a very funny story about who was the fellow who invented Dungeons and Dragons, and how he was interrogated by the FBI in the 1990s because of a game he wrote that had to do with computers that didn't even exist and how to hack them. So the game was about hacking computers. And they insisted somehow, he said it was just ironic. It was just funny because these people kept insisting to me that this is a real hacker's manual. And he said, these computers don't even exist. It's a game. So I think we have problems within the intelligence services because you have people who really want to do a good job, but at the same time, they don't always know what they're doing. Some are very good and some aren't, and they don't communicate well. Cultures of secrecy and power are just like that. They're about the failure to communicate.
So they're kind of like the Postal Service then.
Yeah. Pardon?
I said they're kind of like the Postal Service then.
Well, my postal clerk is very funny. Every time I go to mail something, I get to hear a new story of postal incompetence.
Yeah, see what I mean?
Everything I mail gets delivered, so I'm happy with that. I can't fault them there. Whatever their internal machinations are, it's not my concern. But this has to do with size.
Right.
And whenever we get to, there's optimum sizes of organizational growth, and then when you exceed that, things just get harder and harder to do. And, intelligence services are no different.
Can I ask you a question, Mark?
Sure.
Do you, I was watching a program not too long ago, maybe about a month ago, and it made a very interesting comment. There was a bunch of scientists, doctors, all talking about pandemics, and they made a very interesting comment. And the comment was, it's not a matter of if a pandemic ever occurs on the planet. It's a matter of when. Do you believe that a pandemic is inevitable at some point? And I'm not saying just this Chinese virus. I'm saying something like the Black Plague that is just inevitable at a point where it mutates to a point where we just don't understand it, and it just wipes out a huge portion of the population. Do you think that's inevitable?
Well, you just look at the history of things, the cycles of things, and you can get a fairly good predictor. I mean, there's one predictor that showed that there's roughly every 100 years, we have an experience like this. Now, where it comes from or how, whether it's accident or design, that's all irrelevant. It's just things happen. And this goes back to the notion of control. We think we have more control over things than we really do. And even when we get, as you pointed out, even when we get information, getting that information into the heads of people who can make decisions that will then somehow make the appropriate decision or the best possible decision is very difficult. People make decisions often based upon shared values. And when you get into organizational structures, and this is where we often get into the conspiracy notion, there are real conspiracies. I want to make that very clear. When the Swansea Conference took place in 1942, there were, I think, about a half a dozen leading Nazis there. They all knew what they were doing, and they knew exactly what they were doing, and they edited the notes of the meeting to make them more palatable. Now that's the kind of thing we think of as a conspiracy. But there's other kinds of conspiracies, and those are conspiracies of thought. And it doesn't necessarily have to be some great, occult voodoo telepathic thing. It's just a matter of shared values. And when you go into any organization, whether it's social work or teaching or the police department or intelligence services or anything, you pick it. Certain values often get held in common and then become very precise depending on which organizational structure or industry, aspect of industry or corporation, we'll call it, you're in. So that means that people are going to act the same, even if they don't talk to each other. Now let that sink in. So you could take something to half a dozen or a dozen people in that entity, and there's a very good chance you're going to get the same response from all of them, or most of them, because of the notion of shared values.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
that's very
so
in
I
depth.
think that in some ways should, that's the frightening part. So now, to answer your question, are epidemics going to happen? Sure. Just as locusts are going to happen, and wars are going to happen, and people are going to die.
Oh, and I get what
And
you're saying,
that's
but
it.
let me be more specific on the question. What I'm saying is that based on what I watch, there's two things I believe that are a possibility and probably inevitable at some point. Two natural disasters that could happen to wipe out humanity. One would be a rock with our name on it coming from outer space, and that is a given. They say every 10,000 years or so we get hit with an asteroid or a meteor, whatever you'd like to call it. So there's that possibility. And then there's the possibility of a very microbe-like virus mutating to a point that we cannot control with all our science, and that itself being a natural way of wiping out humanity. So I say to you, basically, in my opinion, I think a pandemic is inevitable at some point. And I'm not saying that the coronavirus is that pandemic. I'm saying that it could be, or there could be another one that's going to come and really create havoc. So again, the question to you is: do you feel that it's just a matter of time until something that big happens?
Well, I don't believe in wiping out of humanity, because that's an extreme. People adapt, and we don't know what the scientific knowledge at that time will be. What we can guarantee and put some solid bets down on is that things will come around, and they're going to be serious, and they're going to have a lot of devastating impact. Now, look at this. This has not had a huge impact in terms of human death toll. This is not even close.
No.
To the influenza of and some of the influenzas and the epidemics of even of the 50s and 60s. This isn't even close. But
you're right.
Look at the impact. Look at the impact it has had economically, politically, culturally, in a very short period of time, in just a few months. The impact has been stunning, and I would say almost irreversible.
I agree with you on that one, but just to quickly add, this isn't over yet. However, that's the terrifying part. I mean, I'm pretty sure this will plateau for a moment, and things will be fine again, but calm before the storm. And it's been proven that this will come back again. That's the frightening part, Mark.
And most likely it will. I mean, that's the reality. I mean, if you read the articles and you look at history, and even the astrology on it, which I've looked at too with some folks, it'll probably come back in December. But then again, what do you do? you look at what has been very good now. I mean, the message here is get healthy and stay healthy.
Right.
You know, get healthy, stay healthy. I mean, what I do, I avoided the people that I avoided. We, get enough food where we don't have to go shopping every day. And then I increase my C intake and get rid of, those things which are detrimental to my immunity. So, but you have to do that ahead of time as well. I mean, I hate to point out the obvious, but a lot of the people, and not all of them, clearly there's exceptions to the rule, but a lot of the people who are dying from this were seriously physically compromised.
Exactly. Yeah.
And as a doctor friend of mine pointed out to me today, if you're obese and you get this, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
Now, 43% of the American population is obese. So,
if I may just add a second, Michael, I spoke to a relative of mine today, and without mentioning any names, I found out that it was a cousin who I was speaking with. His brother has gotten the virus. The thing is, unfortunately, he's got some issues with alcohol, and as a result, it has affected him greatly.
Oh,
and
no.
he is. Yeah, we are currently waiting to see how things turn out for him.
Mike, that's not a good thing. That's not a good thing to tell me while I'm drinking this beer right now.
Oh, I'm sorry. And another word to Mark is you forgot there's one other C intake that you need to add to your list, and that is chocolate, my friend.
That's right, chocolate. This is not to make light of people suffering, but you have to look at what goes on. When people, nature forces us, and I don't say it's intentional. It's not like nature has a plan. Nature just does what it does for the most part. And how we respond to that is up to us. And if people want to say, well, there's nothing I can do, okay, well, then there's nothing you can do. But there's someone down the street who's saying, there's something I can do here.
That's right.
I can be prepared. I can get healthy.
Adapt.
I can cut out the crap and, reduce my junk food intake and exercise more, start thinking positive about solutions and improving the quality of my life and well-being, so that when things cycle around as they will, I won't be as impacted by it. And it's not that you're not going to be impacted. It's about changing the severity of it, doing what you can to control your life rather than playing the role of the victim and then thinking someone's going to swoop in and rescue you, because that's just not going to happen.
No.
It doesn't happen.
Yeah, I'm the same way with in the feeling of having to take care of yourself. Unbeknownst to you, my history is I've already have a compromised immune system because I've had cancer 7 times, and I've had radiation therapy. I've had lots of radiation therapy, chemotherapy, and amongst tons of X-rays and CAT scans and blah blah blah. So I already have my work cut out for me. I have to dose up on vitamins every day, try to eat good. Just recently, I've tried to do my best to cut out all sugar. So
that's going to be hard.
It is. You're right. And I am addicted to vitamin C, vitamin chocolate, and it's very difficult. But at the same time, what choice do I have? I'm 53 now. I've got to be able to take care of myself for the rest of the years that I have, how many decades I have left, hopefully, knock on wood. But I'm not as young as I used to be. I used to live on Twinkies and Ho-Hos and God knows what.
Well, this
Not
is
anymore.
it. This is it, Mike. And I think Mark can agree that this was humanity's wake-up call. The reset button was pressed, Mark, and we have a gigantic... We have a gigantic responsibility now, Mark.
Definitely.
And that responsibility is on the individual level.
Right.
Because only individuals can make that choice.
Amen.
And nature doesn't care what choices you make. Because from the view of nature, there's only cause and effect. There's only karma.
Right.
Cause and result. You do whatever you want, this is the result. And this is the part, when we talk about spirituality and esotericism and all this, that has to be driven home. That is the fundamental basis of the entire cosmos, seen and unseen, is that basic notion of cause and effect. And we can try ignore it and escape it, but well, you can try not to live with reality, but reality is going to come and live with you at some point.
And that I agree with you, Mark.
Yeah. So do I.
Yeah.
Definitely. And of course, you have talked a lot about Hermeticism and the Hermetic principle. Can you tell the audience, for those that don't know what that is, can you explain a little bit about that, Mark?
Well, Hermeticism is a name given to a kind of synthetic philosophy that arose in Egypt from the 1st through 2nd century, or 4th centuries AD, primarily 2nd century, but 1st through 4th with some. And it was named after the Egyptian god Tahuti, who was, or Thoth as we call him, but who was given the Greek name Hermes after the Greek god Hermes, the messenger of the gods. And Hermeticism is that philosophical view that is in part a survival of ancient Egyptian religious or mystical views, if you want to call it that, magical views, and as well as other philosophical notions and some Gnosticism, some Jewish mysticism, and Neoplatonism. And it becomes really very popular in the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance was the rediscovery of ancient learning, but that ancient learning was classical religion and primarily Hermeticism. And at that point, the practices of alchemy and astrology, ritual magic, Kabbalah, all of these things were very popular, and some of the most prominent people of the day were involved. And it had ebbs and flows, like everything comes and goes in cycles. And you had in the 18th century an occult revival, if you will, primarily within Masonic circles. That is, Masonic groups were used as vehicles for that revival. You had it again in the late 19th century with the writings of Eliphas Levi and the French occult revival and the various Rosicrucian and Martinist groups. And that carried us into the 20th century and carried us for many decades. During the British occult revival, the Golden Dawn gets formed. We see that come out of that period. We see the Theosophical movement come out of that period. In Austria, Hungary, and Germany, we see the Ariosophist movement. So a tremendous amount of things are happening. We see the birth of New Thought in the United States. We see the birth of Amorc and a variety of Rosicrucian groups, all in that period. And many of them, not all of them, but many of them would fall under that brand of, or that umbrella term, the umbrella term of Hermeticism to some degree or the other.
Right. And Mark, are you a member of any of these groups?
Not anymore.
You were?
I was a member of many groups for many years, for decades, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
Many people still contact me regarding them, even though I haven't been in them in over 20 years. I still have many friends and connections and relationships that I find were quite pleasant. I have only good things to say about most of my former associations, or mostly good things to say about my former associations.
Yes.
But in order to do what I do, it's not really possible to be involved in too many activities. You have to pick. And when you're involved in a lot of these esoteric groups, these orders in particular, they're an organizational structure, and they have hierarchies, and they want to have the head honcho always wants to be the brightest bulb in the room.
The alpha.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask Mark, your involvement in these organizations of the past. They were all occult related.
Oh yes. I mean, they were very. People in them were very normal. Yeah, very. I met some wonderful people too. I mean, I happened to be at a time when we had a tremendous amount of older members who were World War II veterans and hearing about their experiences. Many of them of a psychic nature. I met people who were brought over in Operation Paperclip. I've met people who were had very interesting experiences during the war, both in intelligence services and otherwise. So it was a good time to be in.
And Mark, why exactly did you choose to leave these groups, if you don't mind answering?
It's mostly administrative. That's really what it came to. It's mostly
I see.
administrative issues.
Interesting.
It's like, yeah, okay, that's the administrative. That's fine. I mean, people forget that these groups have a mundane side, a physical, material side that has to be addressed. They do, otherwise they don't exist. And
what exactly do you mean by that?
Well, they have to do things. They got to run. I mean, they have buildings to pay for, or postage to pay for, or things to take care of. They've got real bills. People,
everyday stuff.
I jokingly say to folks all the time. I said, "You want to join an occult lodge?" Yeah. I said, "Well, okay. Well, how much are you going to pay in dues?" Well, shouldn't spirituality be free? I said, "It is, but the lights in the building aren't."
That's very
right.
true. Very true. And Mark, would you say by joining any of these groups that you have joined in the past, would you say any of these groups have improved your life to any extent?
Well, the groups don't. Okay, it's what you make of it. It's what you do with it. And I was fortunate that at the time I was in, there were some really good people in. So in that regard, I would say yes. I made the most of it. I made the most of what I did. I made the most of who I met. I made the most of those relationships. So in that regard, they did. But it's really, again, it's an individual choice. You have to carefully select whatever organization you're going to become a part of. Know what the exit strategy is, if there is one. You may not want to. You may stay in for all your days, and that's fine. But just make sure it's something you want to do, if possible. That's what I wrote about in my book, Egregores, the occult entities that watch over human destiny, is that any group you get into should be really just as easy to get out of. So you have to be careful. If a group is too easy to get into, it could be too easy to get out of. If it makes your works a little harder to get into, then it might be a little harder to get out of. But you have to then understand why, what's involved. Because it's a relationship, it's a commitment. I should say, it should be a relationship and it should be a commitment on all parties involved. Not just an electronic credit card swipe and something sent to you by email. That's not really belonging. I mean, it's the best we can do at times, but it's a poor substitute for actual human interaction and direct connection with people for the learning process.
Yeah, there's lots of groups out there where you have to pay that admission. Kind of like church.
Well, churches, they provide a reasonable spiritual benefit for their members. Churches have to be maintained. Secretaries need to pay the bills. I always say to folks, if someone wants to complain about what someone else is doing, they're free to volunteer to do it. And
the only thing
that
about
makes
the church
quiet very quickly.
I'm sorry. The only thing about the church is that I never quite found, I don't know, respectable, is that they insist that when you belong to a parish that you give 10%. Is it 10% of your income? It might be more. There's a certain percentage that they demand that you.
There is a notion of tithing, but again, a parish is a particular term. It refers to particularly the Roman Catholic Church. You don't see that phrase for a lot of other organizations. I think we have to look at each denomination, each group individually in terms of what they're requesting or what their membership is. I know most of just as a sidetrack, most of the churches I know of around here, it's around $200 or $300 a year is the membership.
In addition to donations.
Well, if you make it, a donation is a voluntary act. If you don't make it, you don't make it.
No, I get that. I'm just saying, and you're right. It's fair enough to say that I am uneducated in knowing what type of churches or religions ask that you give a certain percentage or whatever their specific points are that they need to, that they ask of their followers. So you're right. I stand corrected.
But and I do know of one, and it's a well-known group, and I knew guys who they were demanding 10%, and I said, well, I asked the one fellow, and I use the term pejoratively. This was a genuine cult, by the way, and I use that in the most pejorative sense of the word.
Aren't they all, Mark?
And they a cult. They were truly had a grip on their members, and they required a 10% donation. And I asked the one fellow who was not making much, and I said, well, how do they know? And you show them your pay stubs so they know what it is. And that was the only time I've ever heard of that, by the way. And that organization was investigated and all types of things. But most people have, fairly good relations. Those who go, I should say, those who participate in organized religion clearly do so because they benefit from it. Just as those who participate in various more loosely affiliated groups or esoteric or occult groups, they do it because they believe they're benefiting from it. Just as people who spend all their time in political activism believe they're benefiting from it in some way.
That's very true. What do you make of this pastor from Baton Rouge who said his congregation would rather die than not go to church as he refuses to stop services during the COVID-19 lockdown? You have many of these individuals out there that are still going against orders, and basically they're gathering all these individuals together in large groups, and I'm sure many of them will get sick eventually.
Yeah, it's really very unfortunate. I understand the notion of the zealous faith. However, we have to look at what's happening and say, my obligation is as a shepherd, is to protect my flock. And if that means having a virtual service, that means a virtual service. I mean, come on, you probably remember Sunday mornings, some bizarre UHF channel, or cable channel somewhere, the church service was broadcast at 10 or 11 a.m., at some point, from somewhere, and we've always had that around here. One of the dioceses broadcast the service every day at noon or something like that, on their cable channel. So if people want to, they can still have relationships in that spiritual communion, because the spiritual communion has a large part to do with physical contact. Being together is very important, but at the same time, it is the beginning of the relationship. It's not the end. So the true relationship is one that takes place within the minds of the believers. And if we are to believe what we're being told, not just is that in the mind, but that transcends the individual mind and connects on some super sensible or psychic or spiritual domain. And that's what unites them to the mystical body of Christ, at least in that philosophy.
This just reminds me of Darwinism, to be honest with you. I mean, just let these people do what they want and end up like the people ended up in Florida during spring break. I mean, if that's the way they want to go out, I say let them.
Well, I think that'd be fine as long as other people didn't have to pay for it or get sick as a result of it.
Right.
If you want to go on a beach or an island somewhere and drink yourself to death and die of dehydration or sunburn or whatever takes you out, or just drown on the sands, that's unfortunate, but it's your choice.
If that's the way they want to go out, I mean, let them. I have no problems with anyone going out dying that way if they want.
But when it becomes, where rescuers become endangered trying to get you, or where other people are placed in a point of danger because of your activities, that's a different ballgame.
That's true. That's why we should just let them go and not have the paramedics or police go. Just let them die off if they'd like, Mark. Why not?
But you don't know that. The problem is how do we decide who is I mean, it's not like they have a stamp on their door that says,
Yes.
I went to the revival meeting. Don't take me to the hospital.
Maybe we should do this. Maybe we should do something like that.
Yeah.
Paint a
So that
paint a
would
red
be-
X on their door.
That would be a very dangerous precedent on quite a few levels.
Well, I already feel that people that are doing this to go to church are dangerous as it is, Mark. before the COVID-19.
See, I've met most of the people I know that go to church are decent human beings. You know, I've met I've had more trouble from the neo-pagan and New Age communities than I've had from fundamentalist Christians that I've had to deal with.
Mike, did you want to add something? I'm sorry about that. I was excited.
Yes, that's okay. That's okay. Thank you, Michael. Mark, I have a question for you. Are you familiar with the name Maitreya Maitre in the Buddhist?
You're trying to say
Maitreya.
Maitreya, right?
Yeah,
Maitreya.
The Buddha of the future. Yeah.
What's your comments about them? Because this person, because I don't even think it's a real person, he's been accused of being the Antichrist. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I've never heard that. I mean, accused of the Antichrist, I've never heard that, and I'm sure someone has, because how we understand these things is always very relative. Maitreya is very important in Theosophy, which, of course, there's not many of them left. It's worked its way into different New Age circles, although I haven't spent any time on it in 20 years, so I couldn't tell you how widely known the notion is. But within Buddhism, or some aspects of Buddhism, it's seen as the Buddha of the future. But that's about all I can say about it. I think in terms of Buddhism, that maybe the listeners would be most interested in, within Tibetan Buddhism, which is very different from Hinayana or Theravada Buddhism, by the way, and is very popular, of course, in the West, and it falls under the practices of Vajrayana and the Tantras, and claims to be mostly of Indian origin, although there's some really scholarship questions on that. Within the Tantras, it's said that there's 4 ages, and this is very similar to the 4 ages that you see in Greek philosophy. And the age that we're in now is known as the Kali Yuga. And this is the densest, most material age. And when the Kali Yuga nears its end, or comes to its end, it's the usual apocalyptic story that you see in other kind of practices as well. And so you see when the Dalai Lama was out there in Central Park several times over the decades, giving these mass initiations into the Kalachakra Tantra, part of that initiation, and it's very complex, there's many levels to it, he usually gives the outer part. I don't remember how many parts there are to it. Like, someone can look that up. Part of the reason for that is that those who accept it are dedicating themselves to become part of the army of bodhisattvas, or enlightened warriors of the future, for this struggle at the time of the Kali Yuga. Now, of course, many will say that struggle is purely a spiritual one, not a physical one. But within some of the tantras and some of the interpretations, they see it as very much a very historical event. And they specifically they say the barbarians, and the barbarians are then specifically named as Islam. And that may have to do with the impact of the Islamic invasions over India and how it wiped Buddhism out. But that's all part of all of that still plays a part or a role in these philosophical practices and ideas, even to this day.
Well, the reason I brought it up is about 2 weeks ago, Michael and I interviewed a gentleman who made a very Catholic man, who mentioned the name of Maitreya being the Antichrist, and here's his whole point, was apparently that this guy was supposed to come in the future and was going to give people cures to disease and give them money and feed them and so on and so forth. And as a result, the man who we interviewed he said that this Maitreya person would eventually switch. How did he say it, Michael? Something like he would reveal himself, and then
Right.
yeah, you would have to follow him and bow down to him. I did try to explain to this gentleman that Buddhism, correct me if I'm wrong, but you could be a Christian or a Muslim or Jewish, and you could still follow the teachings of Buddhism, correct?
Well, that's the big question. And from the Buddhist perspective, yes, you could. But from the Christian perspective or the Jewish perspective, and
No, you
particularly
can't.
from the Islamic perspective, no, you can't.
Right.
So
It's considered
you have to
blasphemous.
understand these questions have to be nuanced that way. So if someone is a Roman Catholic and Roman Catholicism is quite fascinating because it has a great deal of money and energy invested in public relations with regards to how it is perceived in the media, particularly horror films. That's why you'll notice that all of these films show the only way to defeat evil is through the priest and the ritual of Roman rite of exorcism.
Right.
That's not an accident. Okay. At the same time, the church is a real bastion against some real genuine evil, and at the same time has also been terribly infiltrated by it as well, as we've seen with the child abuse cases. And being in Pennsylvania, I'm familiar with some of those people who were named in that report. So the question is, as a Catholic, a true Catholic, he cannot accept anything that is not Catholicism.
That's right. And
Okay.
and I struggle with this.
Therefore, everything is going to be evil in his eyes. Now, I just say that as a statement of fact. So it's not possible to get a reasonable discussion on the matter from him.
You're absolutely
and I've
right.
met fundamentalists of various stripes and different types where it's not possible. I think what we have to look for, instead of something like that, look at it from the Buddhist perspective if you want to understand it. That's the place to go. I think the concern that all these beliefs have is of, let's cut to the chase. They're concerned about singularity, monotheism. We're using those terms interchangeably. The idea of one world government, the idea of one religion, whatever that means, okay? The idea of one arching bureaucratic structure over everything. The idea where everything just suddenly is interchangeable, because we know it's not. Things aren't interchangeable. Cultures aren't, languages aren't, food isn't, people aren't. So in that singularity is death. And they know that.
Well, Michael and I had discussed it after we interviewed this guy, and we both came to the conclusion that it's very difficult to have a rational conversation with someone who is so taken by their religion, because there is nothing you can say to provide logic and or rationality to their thinking. They believe in blind faith, and that's it. You can't change their mind.
And the lack of reason. Unfortunately.
Yeah, well, and you can have blind faith, and it can take you far. The question is, when it comes to an end, then you have to have reason as well. And in various practices, esoteric, spiritual practices, you have to have a blind faith, total conviction of its efficacy. When you learn some of these things, say from a tantric teacher, like good, solid, reputable ones, or good occultists like I have, or tantric Buddhist teachers like I have, Vajrayana, you have to have complete and utter faith in everything they tell you. Unquestionable. And then you take it away and you practice. And you practice with complete and utter devotion.
It's one
You
of the
don't
reasons I
question
got
it at
kicked
all.
out
You
of
just
Catholic
practice.
school.
Now, what will happen then is if you're doing it right, you'll have experiences that will allow you then to ask intelligent questions. You'll have experiences that you can then bring reason to think about and analyze and begin to have a deeper understanding. So you have to be able to go back and forth between, we'll say, those two pillars, if you will. Because reason alone isn't going to do it for you. And just as blind faith isn't going to do it for you. They're both very limited. But combined in particular practices, or in any area of our life, they can take us far.
And that's where psychology comes into play, I would have to assume, Mark.
Sure. That's the ability to reflect and analyze yourself and your actions and your feelings and your thoughts and ideas, and seek to make and to understand them. Where they come from, where they take you. Do you want to keep them? Do you want to change them? And all of that really fantastic depth stuff, which is really a form of spirituality. I mean, that's what spirituality is about, trying to have that deep understanding of all these powerful forces and ideas that we're composed of. We know so little about ourselves. We have these wonderful, fascinating and capacities within us, and yet at the same time, we have some terrifying ones too. And we need at times a steady hand to help us through that, and that's where good teachers come in.
Interesting.
Very interesting, and of course, there's people trying to call in, and I'm not quite sure I could take your calls. Unfortunately, right now, I mean, we have you on the line here, Mark, and anytime these individuals call in, they're calling in groups for some reason. I had like 2 calls right now coming in at the same time.
You know, I posted the phone number tonight, told people to call Michael.
Did you? Is that what it is?
I hope so. I hope I did my job.
Can they text you or use IM or something? Email?
They're going to have to. I mean, I'm not quite sure I could take their calls, but for the most part, some of the callers we get are not that great, in my opinion. I mean, I'm a little disappointed in them. I mean, I wish they could, kick it up a notch here. They're putting me to sleep, some of the questions these callers present sometimes. It's sad.
Well, let's see if maybe we can help them out a bit.
I hope so.
I think within the framework of current events, people are deeply concerned about what they can do. And besides the physical part, a good spiritual practice, a good meditative practice, a good prayer practice is going to be very helpful for maintaining mental health and well-being. And also know that at this time, when there's so much emotional energy floating around and within ourselves and in those around us, that it's very easy to have a lot of phenomenological experiences, whether they're psychic experiences or dreams or unusual occurrences, such as sleep paralysis or those kinds of things, or sightings of lights and things in the sky or in the world around you. My suggestion is not to take any of that too seriously. It's very important that you observe it, but you don't take it too seriously. Because phenomena occurs when the proper causes and conditions come into play. In order to have a fire, you need what? You need heat, you need fuel, and you need oxygen. You take any one of those away and you can't have fire. And that means that fire can happen spontaneously if you have those 3 things present. In fact, that happened to a friend of mine. He had some towels, which they were used in a restaurant and cooking. Actually, was in his church. And I was in the church basement with him when he was doing some work when it happened. And they were soaked in olive oil from wiping up, when you're cleaning the kitchen area. They went down to the basement. They were put in the wash. The wash has detergent in it. Well, oil and detergent forms a kind of primitive napalm, okay?
No kidding.
It washes out. They put them in the dryer. Fortunately, they didn't combust in the dryer, but folded up, put on top of the washer. Fortunately, it was a whole concrete area. Very fortunate that everything was concrete. Folded up and put in the basket. the center area from the pressure and the heat in the center of the pile, it ignited. And that happened
Oh
on his
my
porch.
gosh.
Yeah. Well, they tell you
That's
don't
crazy.
put oil-soaked rags in a pile because that's what happens. Now, it's the same thing with psychic phenomena. If you just bring the right causes and conditions together, it occurs. Same thing with an epidemic, okay, a pandemic. You bring the right causes, it's karma. The right causes and conditions together, and that's the effect. So what we have to do is find out how to not just be an effect in our own lives, but be an active cause for our own betterment in our communities and our neighborhoods. And you start with yourself and your own spiritual practices and your own honesty and your own reflectiveness, and you move forward from there.
I agree with you on that. And there was another individual here in the chat room was going on off about these occult groups and linking them to killing children and drinking their blood, Mark. What do you make of individuals like that, by the way?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again? I was swallowing my water through the wrong...
Oh, shit.
He was going on about occult groups and what?
And occult groups and basically getting into these rituals where they're killing children and drinking their blood. There's people like that out there that believe these sort of things. I'm not quite sure why, but yeah, stars and bars, I see you. Yeah,
they've been told that exists, and they there was a fantastic industry around that in the 80s and up into the early 90s with the Satanic Panic. I think the problem is that folks don't really know what goes on in these groups, and they make stuff up, and they read some books, and they go from there. And there are some very bizarre groups out there.
That I don't deny.
But they're relatively benign. Okay, they really are. There are some extremely good groups out there, and most of them you'll never hear of because they don't look for any attention. And I have no doubt that just as there are thieves and horrible people in all levels of or all professions, whether it's child rapists in being protected by the Vatican. I mean, that's real Satanism, if you want to call it that.
I think the Catholics are more aligned with that, in my opinion, but that's just my opinion.
Or within, you see a lot of the criminal activity that goes on in these fundamentalist groups of all sorts. If you want to look at going to try and give this fellow a more precise answer, if you look at Peter Mark Adams' book, The Game of Saturn, which came out, I think, 2 years ago, he details a very rare and unusual tarot deck. Very unusual. It's not like any other. And he had a very peculiar and special knowledge of classical symbolism, classical knowledge. So he was able to analyze this deck. And he points to a very small but existent group of occultists in the negative sense, we'll call them, the pejorative sense, in Italy during the time of the Renaissance. And they were on hire for the noble families. Was this common? Well, sure. John Dee was Queen Elizabeth's astrologer. He was also working with the King of Poland. Okay, all these people had these things because that was part of the sciences of the day. Was this group in Italy somewhat nefarious? Well, according to the suggestions here, yes. But at the same time, are we going to say that all occultists are like that? Certainly not. I can tell you that not even close to it or a stretch. Most of them are fairly boring people in that regard. They're not. I mean, I've met some wonderful ones, wonderful people but others are relatively boring because it's a wide spectrum. So when we get into this idea of people doing, killing babies and stuff like that, or I say, okay, well, first of all, show me the evidence. Show me what you're saying this on. I'm not going to tell you it didn't happen or may not happen or doesn't happen because I can't say that. but if you're going to say it to me, I need to see some evidence.
Exactly.
I think you're more likely to see a kind of and I use the term occult here very loosely, a real evil in, say, the activities of Jeffrey Epstein and the people around him. Yeah, that was evil.
Right. Yeah, you're right.
And so is the Catholic Church and the way they moved all those priests around after they were caught up with the law as well. That's evil to me.
Well, that was.
Word.
And there you have to get into we have to be very careful with that word. I mean, I don't use that loosely, by the way. I want your listeners to know that I don't use that word loosely. But then we ask a question, these are not monolithic. The church is not a monolithic organization as much as it would like to pretend to be.
By the way, we have Chris C. in the chat room. I think he was trying to call in. He says, question for Mark. What are his thoughts on magic and hypnosis? Do you think they are connected in any way?
Oh, they are, and particularly because hypnosis. I'm going to butcher it here. The paraphrase, something like, our first initiation is in a trance, and when we enter into a trance state, and we're always in one to some degree, okay. But when we enter into what we think of as a hypnotic trance, we're getting to the threshold of the unconscious, and really, magic is about making conscious, which is really what therapy is about. Therapy is about, particularly psychoanalysis is about that as well. But hypnosis is a really good introductory tool for getting to understand how our mind works and how to control it, how to control our own mind. It's really the power of suggestion. So get rid of the word hypnosis and just use the word suggestion, and that makes things a lot easier to understand.
I started using hypnosis from as young an age, at what was I, 13. I read my first book on self-hypnosis, and since then I have moved on to several different books, and I believe very much in hypnosis as well as occult and magic being associated with hypnosis.
Oh, sure, because it's all suggestion. Where every magical ritual, every meditative practice is a form of auto-suggestion and assumption, where you're assuming that these characteristics of these things are real. I like to call it a kind of a controlled psychosis, jokingly. But hypnosis is very good. It's very important for people to understand hypnosis, particularly hypnotic induction, Ericksonian hypnosis. What else? Anything, but if they can move in that direction of understanding NLP and Ericksonian hypnosis, they're doing themselves a tremendous favor. And better still, if they apply it in their own lives to reshape and reformulate their understanding of themselves and their mind and their life so that they can be happy and healthy and whole. They will benefit tremendous. Two of my great uncles were both hypnotists, and I can't say enough about how important it is can be in everyone's life, because then you're going to understand again the power of suggestion, and you'll begin to understand how the media messages are shaped and formed and what their intention is, and how to avoid that, how to control your own mind.
Interesting.
By the way, my main man Renee in the chat room says, can hypnosis cure COVID-19? I love that.
That all depends on your understanding of how the immune system works. I would say that it can assist dramatically in activating the immune system. And that if you have a really good attitude, a very positive attitude, which means to be relaxed and to be healthy and optimistic, that's going to help boost your immune system and help you overcome things. I would like to see if there was a way to do that with people, where sick people could be hypnotized or given hypnotic inductions or suggestions on recordings of some kind. That would be very good. That would be very beneficial to them. and help boost that up.
Well, you can't stress
So,
yourself out. That is true.
Mm-hmm.
That is very true.
Yeah, hypnosis is a great form of being able to control your mind and your body as well. And those who practice it well, that being self hypnosis, are really capable of doing some amazing things in certain cases. So yes, I believe in it very much.
I had a new ager, by the way, Mark and Mike. I had this conversation with her earlier on this week, and she was telling me that to get rid of COVID-19, it takes lots of prayer and wishful thinking. And I told her I have never heard of a virus going away by wishing it away.
Yeah, that's just not right.
I think the problem here is you have two views. That one is, what is the action and what is the effect? What is the cause and what is the effect? And what effect does the mind have not only on our physical body? Well, we talked about that with hypnosis in terms of boosting the immune system.
Right.
But then the question is, what effect does the mind have on the environment outside of the range of the limits of our fingertips? And that's where that's where we move into the study of the paranormal, whether through parapsychology and distant healing, and a lot of areas of practice in terms of, what is the limit of the mind, if any, and how does that work in terms of interacting with the physical world around us, both organically and inorganically. And in theory, she is correct. Okay. At the same time, how do you actualize that? That's the real question. How do you bring that to fruition? And at the same time, why would I say no to effective treatment when it's available to me? Because that would only speed up the process. I mean, the example being, if I had a broken limb, I wouldn't say no to you setting it. I mean, I years ago, I had the tremendous second-degree burns on my hand. And
what were you doing, Mark?
It was from a soldering iron.
Laundry.
And
you weren't burning churches,
laundry,
Mark.
My laundry, right?
You weren't burning. You were burning churches in Sweden.
I wasn't paying attention, is what was happened, and didn't, at the end of the day, it healed rapidly and very quickly. I had a bite too. I was once bit by a client during a restraint.
Holy shit!
Yeah, I had to get tetanus shots, and it was huge. I mean, it was purple and the size of half a golf ball on my wrist, and I said it'll be gone in about a week or two. And the nurse said, I don't think so. I said, you wait. Now, does that mean I didn't put ice on the burn, or I didn't, clean the wound? No, you do all those things. You bring all your forces and energies to bear. And that includes the mind just as much as it includes eating right, being healthy, staying healthy, and, taking whatever medical advice we can that's to our benefit. And this is the key. When people don't take care of themselves physically, that's generally an indicator that they're not taking care of themselves emotionally and mentally as well.
Right. Mark, what exactly happened that you were bitten on the hand? And I'm glad you didn't get Hep C.
Yeah, I was doing a restraint with someone. A client we had was acting out, and we had to restrain him.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you got bit. Can you believe that, Mike? Holy shit.
Yes, I can. But
Wow.
I thought when he said he burned himself, I thought he was doing laundry.
I thought he was burning a church.
No, I have the biting was not. That was probably the least dramatic of my stories. I worked in housing for several years, public housing. So those were that was more dramatic stuff.
Oh, there we go. It's a good thing you don't do that now.
No, but these environments have psychic tones to them. You go to a beautiful concert hall; it has its own psychic energy. Your house has its own psychic energy. Beautiful church does, and so do hospitals and and morgues and cemeteries and playgrounds and housing and all these things. Every place has its own energy, and there are people who are attracted to that energy, and there's spirits, so we'll say invisible beings, that are attracted to that energy too.
I was expecting you to go into the feng shui subject.
I'm sorry, you broke up for a second there.
Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, I'm sorry. All I said was when you were talking about how certain structures, buildings in this case, have certain psychic energy or vibes. I was wondering if you were going to go into the whole feng shui subject.
Well, that's part of it, and feng shui means water, earth, or excuse me, water, air and water, and we in alchemy we call that the mercury. Well, that's the energy of life. If you're looking at a place, how is the air? Does the air move? How does it move? Is there water? How does it move? You don't want standing water. Standing water is disease. That's mosquitoes. That's stagnant. So how does the energies of life, how do they move around a place? And that'll define the quality of physical life you'll have there, and it'll define the kind of psychic entities that are attracted to it, as well as animal life and other things.
And Mark, right now,
but at least we have some management on that. We can affect our physical environment to some degree by how we decorate it or change